We've all heard about Michelle Hadley was born in 1985 in Ontario, California, a city located 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Her parents, who owned a small manufacturing business in town, never had a ton of money, but they always had enough to make ends meet. Growing up, Michelle's parents taught her and her younger sister to always put their all into whatever it was they were involved in, whether it was academics, athletics, or relationships. They also taught their daughters to always take their Christianity very seriously. By the time Michelle was in high school, she had made her parents very proud, becoming one of the top students in her class, and also becoming a very talented cross-country runner. But despite these early successes, Michelle never bragged about them. Not because she was trying to stay humble necessarily, but because that was just her personality. She was a very private person who did not seek the spotlight. After high school, Michelle attended Dickinson College in Pennsylvania on a scholarship, and then after graduation, when Michelle was just 22 years old, she married her high school sweetheart. However, that relationship would not last. When they divorced just 4 years later, Michelle was upset about it, but she was confident that she was going to be okay. She was still very young, she had the full support of her family, and she had a good job that allowed her to be self-sufficient. All she needed to do was to be patient and wait for the right partner to come along. And in 2013, roughly a year after her divorce, it seemed like the right partner had. In August of that year, Michelle connected with a U.S. Marshal named Ian Diaz on a dating website. The U.S. Marshal Service is the federal government's primary agency for fugitive investigations. Shortly after Michelle and Ian connected online, they met in person for the first time over a cup of coffee. At 35, Ian was 9 years older than Michelle. He was tall and fit. Michelle was slender with dark hair and deep brown eyes. They both had great smiles, and right away they hit it off. That first cup of coffee was quickly followed by text messages, phone calls, and arrangements to meet again. On just their second date, Ian blurted out, "I love you," to Michelle. This definitely caught Michelle by surprise, but she was thrilled. As a child, she sometimes fantasized about being a princess and having her Prince Charming come along and whisk her away. And suddenly it seemed like that actually was happening. Over the next several months, the pair would continue to see each other on a near daily basis. And then in the spring of 2014, they moved in together. And then in December of 2014, Ian took Michelle on a trip to New York City where he asked for her hand in marriage. And she would say yes. Michelle was on cloud nine. Ian really was her Prince Charming. Once they were engaged, Michelle threw herself into planning their perfect future together as Mr. and Mrs. Diaz. However, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Michelle would later say that Ian had pressured her to take a $20,000 pay cut to leave her job that she loved and take a marketing position at a place he loved and had once worked himself, Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. She also said that Ian began asking her to wear more revealing, sexier clothes, and he wanted her to get acrylic nails and get her belly button pierced. It wasn't Michelle's style, but since she didn't want to disappoint her future husband, she would, from time to time, put on the crop tops and short skirts just to make him happy. But despite doing that, Ian never really did seem happy, and eventually he would open up to her about some of his deeper sexual fantasies. He told Michelle that what he really wanted to see was her having sex with other men. At first, Michelle was stunned and said, "No, absolutely not." But despite her refusal, Ian brought the subject up again and again, each time with a little more insistence, and then finally, Michelle agreed. On Valentine's Day 2015, with enough cold medicine and alcohol in her system to lower her inhibitions, Michelle had sex with a stranger that she believed Ian had recruited on Craigslist. What Michelle didn't know was that Ian had filmed the entire sexual encounter, and then afterward, he wanted to watch it with her. Michelle was horrified. She begged Ian to destroy this video, but Ian refused and said, "No one forced you to do it." But despite these huge issues in their relationship, they did not cause the couple to end their engagement. In fact, these issues only seemed to bring the couple closer together, if for the wrong reasons. As Ian became more and more controlling of Michelle, Michelle became more and more emotionally dependent on Ian. And so with that in mind, in June of 2015, 8 months before their wedding date, Ian and Michelle took out a mortgage together and they moved into a brand new 2-story condo in downtown Anaheim, California. It was Michelle who came up with the entire $14,400 down payment, but she didn't care. She and Ian were both so excited about a change of scenery to hopefully get their relationship back on track. Just weeks after moving in, all of the excitement of the new place was gone, and in its place were all of their old unresolved issues. Soon, minor disagreements became major arguments, and major arguments turned into vicious accusations of infidelity and betrayal. Finally, the fights turned physical. When Michelle threatened to leave, he held her down on the bed while she tried to kick and claw her way free. Families on both sides of the warring couple had the same advice. You are not good for each other. You need to end it. So at the end of August, just 2 months after Ian and Michelle had purchased the condo together, Ian took back the engagement ring he had given Michelle, and Michelle packed up her Volkswagen Jetta and drove off to stay with her parents. But as much as Michelle and Ian now wanted out of their relationship, as long as they owned that condo together, they could not entirely sever ties. Michelle wanted Ian to sell the condo so she could get reimbursed for the down payment she had made, but Ian liked the condo and had no intention of moving out. This put them at a sort of standstill and kind of forced them to continue interacting despite being broken up. And surprisingly, through their somewhat regular exchanges over this property, they learned how to be cordial again. Ian would text Michelle first about the property, and then he would follow up and ask how she was doing, and Michelle would do the same thing to Ian. Even though this did not get them anywhere closer to solving their condo issue, it seemed like they were at least at a point where they could treat each other with respect. However, this would not last. On September 10th, so 1 month after Michelle had moved out and when the condo issue was still completely unresolved, Ian received a very strange and upsetting message from Michelle. In between friendly, cordial text messages, Michelle sent him a long, bizarre, rambly email that could only be described as biblical in her condemnation of the man she once wanted to marry. She wrote, "Your sins are many, including defiling me and my family with your wicked and evil sexual acts, your financial coercion and irresponsibility, your gluttony, your greed, your lust, your sloth, your wrath, your envy, and most of all, your pride." She finished it with, "You may try to hide behind the law of man, but it is a weak shield that will bend and crack against the sword of God. I will bring the full force of the law and the word of God against you to judge you." Ian knew that Michelle and her family were religious, and he knew from their relationship that Michelle was prone to emotional outbursts. But even by her standards, this email revealed a vengefulness that he had not seen before. Ian was so shaken up by it that the very next day, on September 11th, Ian filed a restraining order against Michelle. After reading the email and speaking with Ian, the judge did not grant the restraining order against Michelle. However, Ian's request had now brought Michelle to the notice of the Anaheim police. Shocked that she had even been the subject for a restraining order, Michelle immediately hired an attorney to handle all interactions with Ian, and Ian would hire an attorney as well. And by November of 2015, the lawyers were finally able to work out a compromise with the condo that would allow Michelle and Ian to finally move on from each other. The deal stated that Michelle would not get back her $14,400 down payment. Instead, she would continue to pay half the mortgage for 6 months. But after that, Ian would either assume full responsibility for the mortgage, or he would have to agree to sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle. Even though neither side was fully happy with this arrangement, they both were just exhausted from all the fighting and were ready to just accept it and move on. And so they both signed the agreement, and then the 6-month timer began. Ian stayed in the condo, and Michelle, who was living with her parents, decided to get her own small apartment and go back to school to get her master's in business. In January 2016, just a month or so after the condo settlement was finalized, Ian Diaz met another young woman through a dating site. Her name was Angela Connell. She was roughly the same age as Michelle, and she was looking for a serious relationship. When she and Ian finally met in person, they both liked what they saw. During their first date, Ian was honest with Angela and told her that he had just recently gotten out of an engagement that had ended very badly, but he was still certain he wanted to get married and raise a family, which was very reassuring to Angela. Only 1 month later, Ian and Angela would get married, and Angela would move into Ian's condo, the same condo he had bought with Michelle. In May, just 4 months after meeting Ian and 2 months away from the deadline for Ian to assume paying the full mortgage on the condo or sell the property, Angela surprised her husband with a sonogram and announced that she was pregnant with twins. The couple was beyond excited. They sent copies of the sonogram of the twins to family and friends, and Angela wasted no time prepping their home for the twins' arrival. Everything had moved quickly, but the couple was very excited at the prospect of starting a family together. Later that month, on May 22nd, Angela was at the condo alone when she hopped on her computer to check her email. Once her inbox loaded, she noticed there was an email from a man named Jason Ray. She didn't recognize the name, but at first glance, it looked like a real email from a real person, not some spam message. So she clicked on it to see what it was. And the words she read sent a chill through her body. The email was definitely not spam. It was a personal message intended for Angela. And whoever this Jason person was clearly knew personal details about her and her husband. The email, which was littered with biblical references, explained to Angela that Ian had been unfaithful to her and that he didn't love her and he never would. Jason also told her that Ian was going to harm her if she didn't leave him immediately. And the email closed by telling Angela that she and her husband had sinned against God. Angela stared at her computer screen for quite a while, wondering what she should do. Eventually, after reading it a few more times, she decided it had to be some sort of sick joke and that the best thing to do was just to ignore it. So she deleted the email, shut her computer, and she walked away. The next morning, Angela logged back onto her computer, and when she opened her email, there was a new email from Jason Ray sitting at the top of her inbox. Angela thought about not even opening it and just deleting it, but her curiosity got the better of her and she clicked it open. Once again, the message was aimed at trying to convince Angela to leave Ian. It was full of biblical references, and at certain points it didn't even make any sense. But there was a new twist to this email versus the one she had received the day before. In this email, the sender, Jason, clearly references Michelle, Ian's ex. Jason would write that Angela was Ian's Eve and Michelle was Ian's Lilith. According to a particular interpretation of Jewish folklore, Lilith was the first wife of Adam from the famous Adam and Eve story. But Lilith was banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam, at which point God made Eve out of Adam's rib, and then Eve became Adam's wife. While somewhat confusing, the message Jason was sending Angela was fairly clear. Angela was not meant to be Ian's wife. Ian's true wife was Michelle. Angela didn't know anything about Ian's ex, Michelle. All she really knew was her name and that she existed. But despite the lack of insight into who Michelle was, Angela couldn't help but think, this email sounds an awful lot like something a deeply scorned lover would send. And so that night when Ian got home, Angela showed him the latest email from Jason Ray and told him, I think this is your ex, Michelle. At first, Ian was confused. He and Michelle had settled their issues. They had moved on, so why would she write this? But after reading the email a few more times and seeing all the over-the-top biblical language that Michelle had previously used in emails to him, he became convinced as well that this probably was Michelle. However, he told Angela that Michelle was very mercurial and that she must have just gotten worked up about something and she's overreacted. That's why she sent these emails, and she's likely to calm back down and they will never hear from her again. However, he told Angela if the emails do continue, please let him know and he would go to the police. For the next several days, Angela checked her email, but no strange emails came through. But roughly a week after that first Jason Ray email arrived, Angela received another email from Jason Ray, and this time the subject line simply said, die. The body of the message read, I hope you are scared of death tomorrow. Be prepared, don't sleep. Be watchful of the daughters of God. We will steal your child and we will watch as it dies. Within minutes of receiving this email, Angela received a barrage of others from Jason Ray, as well as from other account names she didn't recognize, like Lilith Truth. And all of these messages included the threat that Angela was going to be harmed in the coming days, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Angela was horrified and was starting to wonder if this really was something Michelle could be doing. It just felt so evil. Then she noticed at the bottom of one of the emails she had just received that it literally said, from Michelle. It looked like the signature had been automatically entered into the email template, and then Michelle must have just forgotten to delete it before sending. Or, as Angela and Ian stared at it and discussed what it could mean, they thought, well, maybe she left it in on purpose. Maybe she wants us to know this is from her. Either way, at that point, Ian and Angela felt fairly certain that Michelle was really behind this, and so they printed out all of the nasty emails Angela had received to date, and they took that along with the email Michelle had sent Ian the year before that was very biblical in nature, and they took all of that to the courthouse, and Ian would file another restraining order against Michelle. A few days later, on June 6th, 2 police officers went to Michelle's residence and literally handed her the order to appear in court for this restraining order. The date was set for June 17th. But that night, and over the course of the next several days leading up to this court appearance, Angela continued to receive dozens of emails from Jason Ray and Lilith Truth and other anonymous accounts threatening to make her pay for having filed this restraining order. Even though Ian told Angela that there was just no way Michelle was actually going to hurt her, Angela couldn't help but feel terrified and was afraid to leave the house. Finally, June 17th arrived, and Angela and Ian arrived at the court alongside a huge group of friends and family members who were there to support them. When Michelle walked in with her lawyer, she was met with boos and hisses from all of these supporters, and then once court was called to session, Angela and Ian outlined what had been happening over the last couple of weeks, and they showed the judge the stack of all these emails. The judge reviewed the documents and then turned to Michelle and asked her what she had to say for herself. And she would say, "I didn't send those emails. I don't know what's going on. I didn't do this." But the judge wasn't buying it, especially given the fact that Ian had previously filed for a restraining order against Michelle for threatening emails. And so this time, the judge did grant the restraining order, prohibiting Michelle from having any further contact with Ian or Angela. Angela and Ian were thrilled, and when they walked out of the courtroom, they felt confident that this nightmare was finally behind them. But within hours of getting home, Angela started receiving more emails, and immediately they contacted the Anaheim police to report that Michelle was already violating her restraining order. But since the emails they were receiving now were not signed by Michelle, there was no way for the police to prove that Michelle was in fact violating her restraining order. And so for several days, the ferocious, threatening, biblical emails continued, and there was seemingly nothing Ian or Angela could do to stop it. Then, as if it wasn't stressful enough, Angela received an email from an account she had not seen before, inquiring about her rape fantasy request on Craigslist. Angela did not understand what this person was talking about, but eventually, when she went online and investigated, she discovered there was an entire marketplace of people posting ads on Craigslist seeking partners to take part in a rape fantasy. And someone had clearly been pretending to be Angela and was going into these places on Craigslist and responding to all of these ads saying that she, Angela, was interested. And then she would leave them her address and what she looked like and what her daily habits were like. And according to some of these men that were reaching out now to Angela, apparently whoever was doing this was indicating that Angela didn't just want to be a part of some basic rape fantasy. She wanted to be attacked out in public, and she was encouraging these men to follow her and stalk her and then attack her and rape her. And even if she tried to say stop, don't. Angela knew Michelle had to be behind this, but again, there was just no evidence tying these rape fantasy responses to Michelle because she wasn't signing her name to them. And so despite how absolutely horrifying it was to learn this was going on, there was nothing the police could do to stop it. For Angela, this was a nightmare. The stress and the fear of this situation was just so much that she basically just hid in her condo all day long. But on June 24th, so 1 week after the court appearance and just a couple of days after first learning about this rape fantasy ad, Angela had to leave the condo to go out and run a few errands. And so she gathered up her things and she called Ian, who was at work, to let him know that she was heading out in case anything happened to her. And then she left her condo. She went downstairs to the large parking garage underneath their development where residents could park their cars. She hopped in her car and she drove up the ramp out onto the street and then went about her day, running her different errands, and it was totally uneventful. At some point when she was done, she made her way back to the condo complex. She went down the ramp into the underground parking garage. She found her way back to her assigned parking spot. She parked. She got out of her vehicle. She shut the door and she began walking from her car to the door on the far side of the garage that would lead to the stairwell back up to her actual condo. but when she got maybe 30 feet away from this door, she heard movement coming from behind her. She turned around and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize who was walking very quickly toward her, and because she was already completely on edge, given all these threats she's been receiving, threats of bodily harm, threats of rape, she immediately screamed and started running towards this door that would take her to the stairwell. But before she could open the door and get inside, this man had lunged and grabbed her around the neck, and he was trying to pull her to the ground, and he was trying to pull her clothes off. And Angela began punching and kicking and screaming and biting, doing anything she could. And eventually she was able to fight this person off of her, and he quickly turned and ran away. And then Angela quickly picked up her stuff. She ran into the door, ran upstairs, got into her condo, and as soon as her door had shut and locked behind her, she picked up her phone and she dialed 911. And she was so hysterical that when she talked to the dispatcher, they couldn't understand what was happening, but eventually she was able to tell them what had happened and to please come out here and help her. And then a little while later, when the police showed up, they found Angela still totally hysterical in her condo. Her shirt had been ripped in half and she had red spots all around her neck from where this guy had grabbed her. But overall, she was okay. The police would search the building, but there was no sign of her attacker. However, Angela would tell police that she was fairly confident she understood what had just happened. She explained what was going on with her and her husband's ex, Michelle, and how despite this restraining order against her, she was clearly signing Angela up for these rape fantasies on Craigslist. And so most likely this man who had attacked Angela down in the garage was only there because of this rape fantasy ad. The police took down her statement, and then that night they would go to Michelle's residence and they would show her a search warrant that authorized them to search all of her devices, her phone, her laptop, all of them. And when Michelle turned them over and gave up all of her passwords, the police were able to find enough evidence that she was behind the harassment of Angela and Ian that they arrested her on the spot. Angela and Ian were relieved when they heard the news, and that night, while Michelle was in jail, the threatening emails completely stopped. However, the following day, Michelle posted bail, and within hours of her being free again, Jason Ray and Lilith Truth began bombarding Angela's inbox again. Angela was so distraught, she went to the doctor for a checkup, worried that her stress would negatively affect her pregnancy. And to her horror, the doctor would tell her that she had actually lost the twins. She had miscarried. And if that wasn't horrible enough, the doctor also discovered that her cervical cancer, which had been in remission, was now back. While Angela and Ian grieved the loss of their unborn children and wondered what they would do about Angela's cancer, the horrible emails continued. And men kept showing up at their front door, asking to come inside for violent sex with Angela. Finally, on July 13th, so roughly 2 weeks since Angela was attacked in the parking garage, Angela looked out of her window and she saw there was this young man kind of lurking on the side of their condo complex, and he appeared to be hiding. Worried this guy was going to ambush her as soon as she walked outside, she called the police. The police showed up and they spoke to the young man, who would confirm he was there because he was responding to a rape fantasy ad. He said the woman inside, Angela, had told him to come here and have his way with her. After this incident, Ian was completely fed up and he demanded the police do something about this. You need to go arrest Michelle and keep her behind bars. And sure enough, the next day, Michelle was arrested again. But this time, her bail was set for $1 million, making it impossible for her to make bond. Angela and Ian finally were able to breathe a sigh of relief, although they didn't know exactly what she would be charged with or what the legal outcomes would be. For the time being, so long as Michelle was in jail, they knew they were safe. Except Michelle was completely innocent. Yes, she did send that first fire and brimstone biblical email the year before in September, the one that led to Ian filing that first restraining order request that was denied. But after that, she had lawyered up and not had any contact with Ian or his new wife. In fact, the first time Michelle had ever even laid eyes on Angela Diaz was on June 17th when Michelle was in court for that second restraining order request against her, which caught her completely by surprise. She had totally moved on with her life at that point and was dating other people and focusing on school, so when she was asked to come in and defend herself in court, She barely knew what to say. It didn't make any sense. And then when Michelle was arrested for the second time and couldn't make bail and so had to just sit in jail till her court date, her family hired a lawyer to investigate and figure out who was actually behind the harassment, because it wasn't Michelle. And what their lawyer would discover was truly shocking. Every horrible, threatening email that was sent to Angela's inbox was sent by Angela. The rape fantasy ads on Craigslist? Angela. The supposed attempted rape attack on Angela in her parking garage? That was completely made up. It never happened. She made those marks on her neck. She ripped her clothes off. It had all been an elaborate setup by Angela and by Ian. They had been in on this together. At the time they launched this frame job of Michelle, they were only a few weeks away from that 6-month deadline that Ian had to either sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle or take over the whole mortgage. And apparently, Ian and Angela believed their plan would result in Michelle losing her claim to the condo, and their legal agreement around the condo would become null and void, thereby saving Ian from being forced to sell the condo or having to potentially pay a higher price for it. The pair were so convinced this plan was going to work that Angela even lied about being pregnant. It was all a ruse to make it seem like Michelle's harassment had led Angela to lose her pregnancy. She was also lying about having cancer. Michelle's lawyer quickly uncovered lots of these holes in Ian and Angela's plan, and finally, after Michelle had sat in prison for 89 days after that second time she was arrested, she was released. On Tuesday, October 17th, 2017, Angela Diaz pleaded guilty to 10 felony and 22 misdemeanor charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and falsely reporting a crime to a peace officer. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Ian Diaz was not charged with any crimes at the time and continued in his job as a U.S. Marshal. But 2 years later, on December 20th, 2019, Michelle filed a civil rights lawsuit against Ian, alleging that he was in fact the mastermind of the plot that resulted in her wrongful imprisonment. She also brought charges against the Anaheim Police Department for their failure to properly follow up on evidence they discovered early in the investigation that showed the threatening emails Michelle was accused of sending, in fact, originated from the Diaz household. On Friday, May 3rd, 2021, the Anaheim police announced they had reached an undisclosed cash settlement with Michelle, and then a little over a week later, on May 13th, Ian Diaz was arrested and charged the following day with 1 count of conspiracy to commit cyberstalking, 1 count of cyberstalking, and 1 count of perjury for his false testimony in a deposition in connection with a federal civil lawsuit. If convicted, Ian faces a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison on each of the counts. His case is still pending. Since her public exoneration back in 2017, Michelle has gone on to finish her MBA, she has left California, and she found a great job in marketing with a beauty company.
In July of 1846, 28-year-old Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis reported to the Vienna General Hospital in Austria for his first day of work. Vienna General had been established over 60 years earlier, in the 1700s. Dr. Semmelweis was proud to work there, and even more proud to be working in obstetrics, where he'd get to help expecting mothers. As part of his job, Dr. Semmelweis would work in one of the hospital's 2 maternity wards. Dr. Semmelweis felt optimistic, but also nervous. He'd only recently graduated from medical school and was relatively young for such an important position. But his strong work ethic had helped him rise through the ranks quickly, and he was determined to prove himself to his new coworkers. That day, Dr. Semmelweis walked up the cobblestone street to the hospital's double doors. He pulled them open and went inside, walking through the echoey hallways until he reached the first maternity ward, which was called the First Division. He wanted to make a good first impression on his new coworkers, so he smoothed out his mustache and straightened his jacket. Then he opened up the door, and what he saw next completely changed how he felt about his new job. A pregnant woman was kneeling on the floor, crying and screaming, but she wasn't giving birth. She was begging a doctor to let her leave and go to the other maternity ward, which was called the Second Division. The woman on the ground said she would do anything to be transferred there. If she stayed where she was sure she would die. Dr. Semmelweis had heard rumors about the First Division maternity ward. In fact, most people in Vienna had heard these rumors. There were whispers that the first division was far more dangerous than the second, that women who gave birth there were far more likely to become sick and die. Looking on from the doorway, Dr. Semmelweis wanted to rush forward and comfort the crying patient, but the other doctors had already lifted her off the floor and put her onto one of the many beds in the room, assuring her everything would be just fine, but she was going to stay here. Even though Dr. Semmelweis was technically in charge, he didn't want to interrupt what was happening. He still felt like he didn't really understand the dynamic of this place, and he needed to learn his way around the wards and win his colleagues' trust first. A few hours later, the same woman who'd been crying on the floor asking to leave the first division went into labor, and Dr. Semmelweis supervised the delivery. And after seeing how scared this woman was, Dr. Semmelweis let the woman squeeze his hands during the delivery so tightly that his fingers turned blue. Thankfully, though, her delivery went smoothly and she gave birth to a healthy baby. But even though she and her child were okay, Dr. Semmelweis couldn't get the image of her crying and begging to leave the first division out of his mind. The situation still made him very uneasy. He wanted to make sure women did not feel afraid under his care. And so Dr. Semmelweis made up his mind to learn as much as he possibly could about this first division and see what was going on here. As afternoon turned to evening, Dr. Semmelweis pulled another doctor aside to talk about what he'd seen that morning. They stood in the hallway outside the first division, their jackets stained with blood and sweat from a long day's work. Dr. Semmelweis told his colleague that they were both men of science. As such, he asked if there was any scientific proof that the first division was in fact deadlier for the women inside of it than the second division. The other doctor said yes, there was scientific evidence that demonstrated that. He dropped his voice low, just in case any patients were in the halls, and he told Dr. Semmelweis the mortality rate for mothers in the first division could be as high as 18%, but in the second division, it was much lower, only about 2%. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Those numbers meant that nearly 1 in 5 women died in the first ward, but only about 1 in 50 died in the second. Suddenly, that woman's fear from earlier in the day seemed totally justified. The other doctor explained to Dr. Semmelweis that the patients in the first ward seemed to be dying of something called childbed fever. This was a poorly understood illness that affected women who'd recently given birth. 1 to 3 days after delivering their baby, these women would develop severe abdominal pain and high fevers and would sometimes become delirious, and then they would die. Dr. Semmelweis' colleague stopped speaking for a second as another doctor rolled a woman by on a gurney. When she was back in the maternity ward, safely out of earshot, the doctor continued. He said there had been plenty of meetings at the hospital to discuss the differences between the two wards, but even one of the hospital's leading disease experts, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Jacob Kolechka, couldn't find anything to explain the vast difference in mortality rates. Dr. Semmelweis scratched his chin and glanced down at his blood-stained jacket. It really needed to be washed, and he really needed to get home and get some rest. He thanked his colleague for the information, and as he walked down the hospital's hallways, he thought over everything he'd just learned. Dr. Semmelweis believed it was his responsibility to figure out exactly why so many women were dying at this hospital in this first ward. He decided that the very next day, he would visit the second division and try to learn what made it so much safer than the first. The following morning, Dr. Semmelweis grabbed a new, crisp white coat from his office and put it on. He walked down the echoey hallways toward the maternity wards, then opened the door to the second division. It looked nearly identical to the first division. Dr. Semmelweis took note of the same pale walls, the same beds lined up in rows, the same ventilation systems bringing fresh air into the room. However, the patients in the second division seemed much happier and more at ease. Dr. Semmelweis walked past their beds to the back of the room where all of the equipment used during deliveries was stored, and he began pulling open a few drawers. Inside of them, he saw stacks of metal forceps and scalpels. They were the exact same tools used in the first division. Dr. Semmelweis turned away from the storage area and back to the main section of the room, where he watched staff members bustle from one patient to the next. And that's when he noticed something interesting. There was one major difference that Dr. Semmelweis could see between the staff of the two maternity wards. and he thought it might be the key to solving this mystery. Several months later, the doctors and medical students who worked in the first division gathered in one of the hospital classrooms where medical lectures were normally held. It was a small space with wooden tables lined up in front of a chalkboard. Dr. Semmelweis stood at the front of the room, deep in thought, one hand nervously twirling the end of his mustache. Over the past few months, he'd gone back and forth between each ward, taking note of how the different staff members worked. Eventually, he believed that he'd gathered enough evidence to prove his theory, and so he'd called this meeting with everyone who worked in the first division to let them know what he'd discovered. Once everyone was in their seats, Dr. Semmelweis announced that he'd been keeping a careful eye on the first and second divisions, looking for something that could explain the huge difference in mortality rates. He said the two wards were similar in almost every way except for one. The first division, so the more deadly division, was staffed entirely by male doctors and medical students. The second division, the safer one, was staffed by female midwives. In the mid-1800s, when this story took place, midwives would have gone through an apprenticeship program, not a formal medical education. Because of this, they were considered less educated than doctors and wouldn't have been allowed to teach medical students. But since Vienna General was both a hospital and a medical school, it needed two maternity wards, one for doctors who could train students to handle pregnancy and childbirth, and another one for midwives who mostly managed the place themselves. For Dr. Semmelweis, the fact that the two wards had such different personnel seemed very important. Then Dr. Semmelweis said something that shocked this room full of doctors and medical students. He wondered aloud if maybe the midwives actually knew how to deliver babies better than the doctors. The doctors scoffed, and the medical students shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the idea that midwives might be more knowledgeable than they were. Dr. Semmelweis was uncomfortable too. It wasn't easy for him to consider that after years of medical training, he might not be as much of an expert as he thought. But Dr. Semmelweis didn't want to let his ego get in his way, so he pressed on. He told the men he'd noticed that women gave birth on their backs in the first division. That was a standard procedure for doctors, supposedly because it gave them a better view and more control over the birthing process. But in the second division, the safer one, where the midwives worked, women typically gave birth on their sides. This tended to be more comfortable for the patients and reduced the risk of injury. Dr. Semmelweis theorized that this difference might be the reason why so many women were dying in the first division. He told the doctors and medical students that moving forward, every woman giving birth in the first division should lie on her side instead of her back. Dr. Semmelweis watched the men murmur and roll their eyes, but he didn't react. He just thanked them for listening as the meeting ended. Then they filed out, leaving Dr. Semmelweis alone in the classroom. He exhaled, glad that the meeting was over. He still felt relatively new at Vienna General, and taking on this responsibility made him nervous. But he'd stepped up and done what he could to fix the problem in the two maternity wards. He left the classroom hopeful that this new change he had just implemented would actually work. Over the next few months, Dr. Semmelweis spent more time in the first division, making sure everyone was following this new protocol by having the patients give birth on their sides. Now, there was not an immediate change in the mortality rates, but Dr. Semmelweis held on to hope that his idea would work eventually. Only it didn't. Almost every day, Dr. Semmelweis heard about or witnessed multiple women dying in the first division. He had to admit that his theory must have been wrong. Even with this new policy, the mortality rate in the first division was as high as ever.
Echoes of a distant melody in the nights, just you and me. Photographs and shades of gold, stories that we've never told, memories that never.
In February of 1847, less than a year after Dr. Semmelweis started his job at Vienna General, an average of 2 women died every single day in the first division. Desperate to figure out what was really going on, Dr. Semmelweis spent his mornings in the hospital morgue doing autopsies on women who had died of this childbed fever. He, along with many other doctors and medical students, searched the women's remains for some clue as to what was really killing them. One morning, Dr. Semmelweis stood in the cold morgue, taking shallow breaths and trying to ignore the smell of death. He'd asked the hospital's disease expert, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, to sit in on the autopsy. Dr. Kolechka was tall, broad-shouldered, and clean-shaven, with dark hair that he kept combed to one side. Dr. Semmelweis saw him as a mentor and was glad to have him looking on. Dr. Semmelweis pushed his scalpel into a woman's chest and began dragging it down her body. He peeled back layers of skin, fat, and muscle, and he found the same thing he did in other women who had died of childbed fever, an inflamed abdomen full of swollen sores and pus. Dr. Semmelweis and Dr. Kolechka both agreed that these were clear signs of some kind of infection. And yet, neither of them could determine what exactly the infection was or how it was spreading in the First Division. Dr. Semmelweis set his scalpel down and rested on a metal stool. He looked around. He was surrounded by dozens of dead bodies of women he was supposed to care for. He had blood on his hands, literally from the autopsy, and also figuratively, because he clearly had not been able to prevent all these women from dying, and so he felt like he had totally failed them. Dr. Semmelweis stood and wiped his hands on his jacket. He then told Dr. Kolechka that he needed a break from this place, the morgue, the maternity wards, the entire hospital. Maybe a vacation would help him clear his mind, and he could come back and look at the problem with fresh eyes. Dr. Semmelweis took off his bloodied jacket, hung it on a hook on the wall, and then went to tell his supervisors that he was taking a trip to Venice. A few weeks later, in March of 1847, Dr. Semmelweis returned from his vacation. The time away had done him good. He'd been able to rest, to enjoy the museums and food that Italy had to offer. Now that he was back in Austria, Dr. Semmelweis felt reinvigorated. He showed up at the Vienna General Hospital for his first day back at work, and as soon as he walked inside, one of his colleagues rushed up to him in the hallway. The doctor looked pale and sad. He told Dr. Semmelweis that there had been a terrible accident while he was gone. His mentor, Dr. Jacob Kolechka, had died. Dr. Semmelweis was shocked. Dr. Kolechka had been young. He asked his colleague what happened. The other doctor sounded unsure as he explained it. Dr. Kolechka had been doing an autopsy on one of the women who died in the First Division. It was all routine. Some medical students were even in the room helping with the examination. Then one of the students accidentally cut Dr. Kolechka's finger with their scalpel, and the wound became infected, and a few days later, Dr. Kolechka was dead. Dr. Semmelweis swallowed the knot that was growing in his throat, and he shook his head in disbelief. The story was as heartbreaking as it was frightening. Dr. Semmelweis did autopsies all the time. He never imagined that getting a tiny cut during one of those autopsies could kill him. But while Dr. Semmelweis was obviously reeling from this terrible news, his mentor's death also made him curious. He asked his colleague if an autopsy had been done on Dr. Kolechka's remains. His colleague said yes, and said that he would go down to the lead pathologist's office and grab the records if Dr. Semmelweis wanted him to. Dr. Semmelweis just shook his head and said he would head there himself right now. Just a few minutes later, Dr. Semmelweis sat in his dimly lit office, poring over his mentor's autopsy report. What he found in those pages astonished him. The physician who had performed Dr. Kolechka's autopsy wrote a detailed account of what he had found inside the dead man's body. Dr. Kolechka's abdomen was inflamed and filled with swollen sores and pus. It sounded exactly like what happened to the women in the First Division who died of childbed fever. This was odd because the medical consensus at the time was that only women who had recently given birth could contract childbed fever. But Dr. Kolechka's autopsy report seemed to prove that idea wrong. Dr. Semmelweis thought it all over. His mentor had been doing an autopsy on a woman who died of, apparently, childbed fever, and Dr. Kolechka got a cut on his finger, which then became infected and led to his death. To Dr. Semmelweis, only one possibility made sense. Dr. Kolechka must have caught childbed fever from the corpse, that somehow it got into that cut. Suddenly, everything clicked for Dr. Semmelweis. The answer to the mystery of the First Division was right there in front of him. It all led back to the morgue. Dr. Semmelweis knew that each morning, doctors and medical students completed autopsies in the morgue. He did it too. And like doctors everywhere in those days, they did their grisly work barehanded. That's why it was so easy for Dr. Kolechka to get cut. Then, after being elbow deep in dead bodies that were often filled with infectious diseases, they would head up to the maternity ward to deliver babies, often without washing their hands first. Looking over his mentor's autopsy report, Dr. Semmelweis theorized that Dr. Kolechka contracted childbed fever from what he called cadaverous particles inside the corpse he was examining. They were probably all over the unwashed hands of doctors and medical students who did autopsies each morning. Then they spread those particles to women in the First Division, directly causing the spread of childbed fever. And Dr. Semmelweis had a clear explanation for why the same thing did not happen in the Second Division that was run by midwives. Midwives do not do autopsies. So there was no way they would ever come in contact with any of these so-called cadaverous particles that could spread this illness. Dr. Semmelweis pushed the autopsy report aside. He jumped up from his desk and sprinted down the hallway to the First Division. His findings could save countless lives. As soon as he got to the first maternity ward, Dr. Semmelweis made an announcement. After completing their autopsies, all doctors and medical students would be required to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before they entered the First Division. Chlorine was one of the only known chemicals that could completely remove the smell of dead bodies from clothing, medical tools, and people's skin. Because it got rid of the scent, Dr. Semmelweis figured it would also remove the cadaverous particles that were spreading this deadly illness. And the results of this new hand-washing policy were remarkable. In April of 1847, the First Division had a fatality rate of 18.7%. By June, the fatality rate had dropped to only 2.2%, about the same as the Second Division. Dr. Semmelweis had just inadvertently discovered how to use hand washing to stop the spread of infectious disease. These days, we know the cadaverous particles he talked about were actually just germs. But this was years before the scientific community began to accept the idea that disease can be caused and spread by microorganisms like bacteria and viruses. At the time, the idea of hand washing with anything more than just water was totally radical, and Dr. Semmelweis actually faced a serious backlash for his suggested policy. Many doctors at the Vienna hospital undermined him and refused to follow his protocols, because according to them, doctors were gentlemen, and gentlemen's hands were always clean. Dr. Semmelweis fought back and actually ended up losing his job. And unfortunately, after he was fired, the hospital returned to its totally unhygienic way of not requiring doctors and medical students and everybody who's on staff to wash their hands. It would take another 20 years for germ theory to catch on elsewhere and for hand washing with antibacterial chemicals to become common in medical facilities. By that time, Dr. Semmelweis was dead. He passed away in 1865 after contracting a bacterial blood infection called sepsis, which, ironically, he got after a cut on his hand became infected.
Streets of neon glow, silent whispers, tales of woe. In the dark our secrets show. In this art our love will grow. Time moves on but we
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Bennett Logan. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr.